All right, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to the 18th Annual Undergraduate Showcase. So my name is Kate Jones, and I have the good fortune to be the chair of the Undergraduate Education Committee, which means that the best part of that job is getting to read the papers that are nominated for our own History Department Awards, as well as for university-wide awards. And that really is something that is a real delight to get to see the range of research projects that people have undertaken across different parts of our department, from theses to papers that come out of our exit seminar series. We really get to see an incredible breadth of projects and really well accomplished. And so you're going to get to enjoy a sampling of those projects this morning. And so I'll just note, so as it says, it is the 18th annual one, which is kind of shocking because I believe I was here for the first one, which is disorienting. Yeah, good, I'm glad to be alive. And we've done it every year except for 2020, so this really is an important tradition in our department and an opportunity to really celebrate the work that you all do as students and the work that my colleagues do as advisors and mentors on projects. And I'll just note that if you are curious and doing a little excavation and seeing how these things have evolved over the years, these presentations are recorded and posted on the department's YouTube channel, so you will be immortalized in that digital space. And so this is really a chance to recognize just the exceptional research our undergraduates do. So the way we're going to kind of operate this morning is we're going to have two panels. So I'm going to introduce the speakers for each panel separately, and then we'll have a little break in between and come back for the second panel, and there's coffee and water in the back there, so help yourselves. And yeah, welcome, and so glad you're here. So the first panel the first presenter on our first panel is Grace Mena, and her paper is entitled God's Gay People, the Gay Independent Catholic Movement in 1970s New York and Quebec. And this is a paper that she developed in the History 196H, Sex in the City, taught by Professor Mark Matera, who's there in the audience. And this paper is the recipient of multiple awards, so I'll just read the slew of them. The Linda Peterson Award in Queer History, the Hitchcock Award for Best Overall Undergraduate Paper, the 2026 Chancellor's Award, and the 2026 Dean's Award. So that's our first presenter. Come on up, Grace, and I'm just going to, as I call your name, I'll read your name, please come on up, and I'm just going to introduce you as before we'll let you all present at once. Our second presenter this morning will be Jade Glenser, and the title of her paper is Reinscribed in Stone, the Repurposing of SETI I Sarcophagus Across Eras. And this is a paper that was completed for Special Topics in Ancient History, taught by Elaine Sullivan. And this paper received the History Department Linda Peterson Award in Ancient History, the 2026 Dean's Award, and the 2026 Center for the Middle East and North Africa Undergraduate Research Paper Award. So congratulations. All right, and then the third presenter on the first panel is Vivian Sutikarn Zelenardo. Forgive me if I made mistakes there. And the paper title that she'll be speaking about is called Remove Even the Roots, Children's Perspectives and Changing Landscapes of Cambodian Genocide Literature. And this is a paper that was developed in the class 194U, the Cold War and East-Asia, taught by Professor Noriko Aso, who's here in the audience. And this paper received the Linda Peterson Award in Southeast Asian History and a 2026 Dean's Award. So Vivian, want to come up? Thank you. All right, take it away, y'all.
You guys can go.
Yeah. Okay. If you guys sit up here, I wanted to make a spectacle of you, so I appreciate your indulgence. Keep the blood pumping.
Hi everyone, I'm Grace, and as Dr. Jones said, my paper is God's Gay People, the Gay Independent Catholic Movement in 1970s New York and Quebec. And so this paper was for 196, the Sex in the City seminar, and I come into it really excited because it's a world history class, so I could learn about Quebec. And I was not expecting to do a paper about religion at all, but I found an article in a gay rights publication in Quebec in the 1970s talking about oh, here's this great gay Catholic church you could go to. And I was like, and they were advertising, oh, there's a Latin Mass there, and they have Mass in French and English, and sometimes they do a 6th century Mass, and sometimes they do the Latin Mass, and I was like, oh, that's very different from what I tend to hear about this topic. So I'll give you just a overview of what's in the paper here. How did we get here? So I trace it back, and it turns out it started in New York. There was an earlier history in Atlanta in the 1940s and 50s of gay Catholicism specifically. But that's not totally connected to this, but they did talk. So in 1970, Stonewall was in the very near past, and the city was very much shaped by that New York City. And there was a man called Robert Clement who was trying to form gay Catholicism in the city, and so what he does is he goes to the first Christopher Street Liberation Day parade, which is the parade to remember Stonewall, and he hands out flyers that have the God descending down to tell gay people this is your church, you should come to this church. And so what happens is 600 people attend the church, and that's as many people as fit in the room. Plus some more. There are some people who can't come to this Mass because there just physically is not enough space. So a lot of demand for this. And then in the mid-1970s, a man from Canada discovers the church in New York, and he says the people of Canada would really like this, and so they ordain him, and he opens a church in Montreal, which is the church that I found initially. And then after that, a church is opened in Quebec City as well. So what does a church like this believe? So it's based out of Old Catholicism initially. It's a break from Old Catholicism. And that was a movement that broke with the Roman Catholic Church in the 19th century over papal infallibility, so they weren't so into the level of power the Pope was being given, essentially. And the church as a whole focused on the early church a lot. The dates they give for when did the church go wrong are 600 something, 1066. So it's been a while for them. The church has been wrong for a little bit. They think that really it's those times that the church started caring so much about kind of sexuality and personal morality over bigger questions about welcoming people in and helping people. So they would place it about there. And then they believed that Jesus was gay as well. And that's why they have their name, the beloved disciple, because they believed that Jesus was in love with the beloved disciple, John. Their main thing was the churches surrounding them are very worldly and modern because they care so much about sexuality. So I'm going to leave you with a question, really, and I'm going to explain this question a little bit. So my question for you all is, who does tradition belong to? And there are a few reasons I ask this. A big one is thinking about what kind of tradition are we caring about when we say this word, when we think about tradition in religious freedom, for example. Are we thinking about just the sexuality part? Or are we thinking about like who's doing a Latin Mass and who's like making an effort to revive all of these things that they're seeing in the history of the church? And we can think about this as a time as well where the Catholic Church is very much, the Roman Catholic Church is very much modernizing in a lot of ways. They don't do Latin Mass anymore. They're changing a lot. We can think about the fact that a lot of, in Quebec specifically, which was modernizing a lot at this time, a lot of the people responsible for that modernization were Roman Catholics, and so they were doing a lot to make the city very different to what it ever had been before, but at the same time really policing sexuality as a part of that, and keeping more of that part of the tradition and going a very different way from where Quebec had been in other senses. And we can think about that, like I said a little earlier, in questions like gay marriage. The church in New York, they did what they called Holy Union, which was not quite marriage, and some of that is about they didn't want to call it marriage because they were kind of like inviting legal trouble in that way, but it turned out that calling it Holy Union still invited legal trouble because the city clerk of New York said, you're doing gay marriage, that's not allowed, and they had to protest in his office in order to get him off their back. So yeah, it's a question of whose religious freedom are we respecting, who is allowed to own that word tradition. Yeah, so I'll leave you with that. Who does tradition belong to? Thank you.
All right, so my paper is about the sarcophagus of Seti I, and it takes a really in-depth look at the history of this particular ancient object to see how it has had different uses and meanings throughout time. So the sarcophagus was originally created during Egypt's New Kingdom era for the pharaoh Seti I, and ancient Egyptians believed that the soul maintains a connection to the body after death. So the sarcophagus, which is like encapsulating those remains, was pretty religiously significant. And part of the reason for that was that it could provide protection, not only by making it harder to like physically get to and like actually disturb those remains, but Seti I sarcophagus is covered in these intricate hieroglyphs and images, some of which are protective spells. So for one example, it reads, "Thou shalt never die, lifted up and driven away are the calamities which were to thee." The majority of the hieroglyphs, however, make up what's called the Book of Gates, and that sort of tells the story of how each night the sun god was thought to travel through these 12 sections of the underworld, separated by gates, in order to successfully bring the sun up the next morning. And it was thought that pharaohs, like Seti I, would have a sort of divine reincarnation and actually become the sun god after death. So having this on his sarcophagus was sort of like giving him a guidebook, telling him what to do and what to expect in the afterlife. So here you can see that this object was really not intended to be like a display piece. It was really meant as a tool that could protect and guide Seti I in his life after death. That all changed in the 19th century. At the time, Egypt was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, a lot of European powers were sort of carving it up and creating spheres of influence. In particular, the British and the French were really fiercely competing with each other to acquire as many Egyptian antiquities as possible. So the British Consul General ended up hiring this former circus strongman turned antiquities hunter, Giovanni Balzoni, and it was he who in 1817 uncovered the sarcophagus. And he recognized that this was a very aesthetically powerful and valuable object. So one of the first things he did is he carved his name onto the side of it. The sarcophagus was then brought back to the British Museum, as most objects were. Newspapers at the time talked about this being like a show of British superiority, sort of like a trophy that was showing that they had this really impressive object and the French didn't, so therefore they're better. The sarcophagus was priced at like 2,000 pounds, which is the equivalent of about 255,000 USD today. So after a couple of years debating the price, the British Museum actually decided not to buy it, and it went up onto the public market. And this created quite a lot of concern that a foreigner, worst case scenario Frenchman, might buy the sarcophagus. So one of the newspapers at the time writes about this saying, certainly the loss would have been severe, not merely in the deprivation of a unique relic of ancient art, but in the reflection of it being possessed by a rival and jealous power. It didn't end up going to a foreigner. It was actually bought by a British professor and architect named Sir John Soane. And he used it to throw parties. So he had this really impressive antiquarian collection. He had like Greek and Roman artifacts as well, but the sarcophagus was like the centerpiece of his collection. And he would have like 500 people come over in one night who were like earls or members of parliament, like London's high society, and he would light up the sarcophagus in this really impressive way. So he spent the equivalent of like 9,000 USD today just on lamp oil to keep these lamps lit to light up the sarcophagus. So he's really using it to create a spectacle that shows off his own wealth, his power and influence in society. In the modern day, the sarcophagus is still in Sir John Soane's house. It's now been turned into a house museum, so everything is frozen in time exactly as it was when he died. And the museum really focuses on Soane's life without considering oftentimes the ancient history of the artifacts in his collection. For example, their homepage says, please consider supporting us to secure Soane's legacy for future generations. So they're really taking a positive light on his collecting practices in a way that doesn't acknowledge the imperialism and colonialism that really allowed this collecting to be possible in the first place. For example, they throw these late night events to this day where they light up the sarcophagus in a manner akin to what Soane used to do, and people sometimes even come dressed in like historical era garb. So they're really creating a sort of nostalgia for this collecting area that is pretty problematic when you think about it. So the takeaways of my paper are, first of all, objects do not have set meanings. They fluctuate a lot depending on who has the objects and who is exerting control over them. Second of all, museums are not neutral spaces. They actually have quite a lot of control over what narratives are told. And finally, I would advocate for a greater transparency and acknowledgement of the imperial and colonial conditions in which many objects were taken and placed into Western museums. So, thank you. Wait. Oh, let's see. Okay, there we go.
Hi guys, good morning everyone. My name is Vivian Zalanardo and my presentation is called When We Weave in the Roots, Children's Perspectives and Changing Landscapes of Cambodian Genocide Literature. I wanted to thank Professor Osso for her mentorship. I really appreciated all of her help over the course of this senior thesis. So I'm actually beginning with my main arguments, which are also kind of my conclusions. But in this thesis, I argued that analyzing various children's perspectives and literature is necessary for a clearer understanding of the Cambodian genocide's impact, especially as children of the time comprise an ever-growing portion of living survivors to learn from. I argue that it is important to analyze how mediums and genres around the genocide have evolved over time, given the shift from personal memoirs and interviews to educational missions such as museum exhibitions, children's books, and new school curriculum. It is imperative to listen and learn from the experiences of child survivors in the context of this genocide. So this is kind of personal to me, but in the fall I did a study abroad in Argentina and Chile where we visited memory sites and learned a lot about the military dictatorships that happened in both countries, and this really inspired this project for me. I visited this museum. It's a public museum in Chile, and I saw an exhibit with so much children's art, other primary sources related to children in the context of this military dictatorship. So this is some of the art I actually saw, and it really, really inspired this paper for me and inspired me to look more into genocide and childhood studies in general. So we as historians love our timelines, but this is some of the Cambodian genocide chronology. I wanted to start with the US. In 1969 to 1970, there was a US secret bombing campaign in Cambodia instituted by Nixon and Kissinger, which led to the ousting of Prince Sihanouk in March of 1970 by Lon Nol, creating the US-backed Khmer Republic. And on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh, forcing millions of people into the countryside. And the Khmer Rouge published the first four-year plan in 1976, proclaiming the democratic state of Kampuchea. From 1976 to 1979, the S-21 Tuol Sleng Security Prison operates as the main interrogation and torture center, while many others are murdered in the countryside and killing fields and at other sites as well. And in December of 1978, Vietnamese troops and forces of the Kampuchea United Front for National Salvation began fighting the Khmer Rouge, leading to the capturing of Phnom Penh again in January 7, 1979, toppling the Khmer Rouge regime, which murdered around 1.5 to 3 million Cambodians. Then in 1991, Paris peace agreements end decades of civil war and provide a framework for transitional justice, but Pol Pot passes or dies before he is charged with anything. So this is actually a central part of my paper. I analyzed this innocent child versus child soldier. I frame it in this way. It was super interesting for me, but some main points on the side of the innocent child narrative is there's a loss of innocence and lack of agency for children. We also see a lot of motifs of childhood, such as the New Year, which is actually when the genocide begins, when people are forced out of Phnom Penh. So many children remember the New Year. There's also a lot of motifs of clothing. One little girl wrote about a red dress that she remembers having, which the Khmer Rouge burned as she switched out for the black pajamas. The Khmer Rouge also targeted civilians, which they deemed as subversive, meaning they either just saw civilians as intellectuals, politically opposed to their regime, and the Cham Muslim and Vietnamese minorities were targeted as well. There's also a Khmer Rouge attack on the concept of family. One author even wrote that family as a word or as a phrase was changed completely and it came to mean spouse under the Khmer Rouge. There was also the beginning of this idea of year zero. That's why my paper is titled Remove Even the Roots, because Pol Pot wanted to dig up the roots of Cambodian society, which were these children that were going to perpetuate this Western imperialist ideology. Also themes of starvation and guilt. Many children remember feeling so starved or just guilty for stealing food from relatives, stealing food from elsewhere. And then following the genocide, there's international accountability for the violation of rights of children. So on the child soldier perspective, which I would argue is the more complicated one, Pol Pot actually stated, it is the youth of today who will take up the revolutionary tasks of tomorrow. So there was a lot of indoctrination through songs. Obedient children, or children that were deemed as strong, were conscripted, and illiteracy rates during the time were extremely high, meaning that propaganda was very, very common. And I studied this case of this child named Akira, who was an ex-child soldier who ended up dedicating his life to landmine removal because of the intense guilt. And lastly, I wanted to close this part out with the undeserving versus deserving victims argument, which I deemed as problematic because the genocide binary traps children who had no other choice. These children were forced into becoming perpetrators, making it a very complicated case because how do you deal with that following the genocide? In Argentina, I learned that this is called symbolic enactment. How do you deal with the effects of the genocide once it ends? And then the second part of my paper is actually me kind of talking about the sources I used too, but I kind of followed this chronology of literature around the genocide because, you know, when a genocide happens, there's news articles and whatnot that become released worldwide, but in the early 2000s, we start to see people who were children during the genocide write about their stories through memoirs. So there's First They Killed My Father by Long Ung, which has become a Netflix documentary. It's very famous now. When Broken Glass Floats by Chandrathi Him. And then the one in the middle is actually a compilation of short memoirs called Children of Cambodia's Killing Fields. And then moving on into the later 2000s or the 2010s, these were more recent. I looked at Half Spoon of Rice, which is a children's picture book, and Sun and Moon, A Chimera Journey, which is a graphic novel that was really cool. It used like magical realism. But I looked at these two because it's important to look at how the genocide is being taught to children in the context of today, in the context of present day. How do we continue to teach children about a genocide that is really difficult to talk about? And then finally, I looked at oral histories and museum exhibits because this shines a light on individuals who aren't able to tell their story through writing. There's certain projects like with Long Beach that were really interesting. This one's actually on YouTube, it's very accessible. And then for museum exhibits, this is actually at Tool Slang. So again, just broader ways to inform the general public, making this information accessible. This was an exhibit on children specifically. And then finally, we all have our challenges. I wanted to talk a little bit about challenges during my research. So one of them was searching for related sources about or from children in particular. A second one was how accurate are things that were written or said later in life. I feel like oral history is contested oftentimes for this very reason. There was a lot of controversies around a couple of the memoirs too, which were really interesting. Third, there's not a lot of academic scholarship about children and cultural memory during the Cambodian genocide. This is still an emerging study, both the Cambodian genocide as a whole, because it's more recent than, say, World War II, but then at the same time, Southeast Asian studies is also kind of an emerging field in history. And this is the unfolding of a larger project about childhood education and cultural memory in relation to genocide for me on a personal level. So I wanted to leave you guys with this quote, and thank you for listening today.
So Jade and Grace, if you all could come up. Thank you all so much. Those were terrific presentations and really we've all got a lot of questions. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So if it's okay, I'll let you all feel about, I'll also keep an eye out for questions. So please share your questions for our presenters this morning. Yes.
Jade, I'm curious for your one, like you said they still light it up today. Does that cause damage to the sarcophagus at all, if you know?
I don't believe it does. They're just like putting lights on the outside to sort of like create that effect. It's actually made of like Egyptian alabaster, also called calcite. So it's like pretty white and it doesn't take a lot of lighting to make it light up that way. It's sort of like an effect of the material that was used.
I had a question. I've got lots of them, but Vivian, I was curious if you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned the Khmer kind of objection to, or you called it an attack on the family as a concept and a kind of redefinition. Could you say a little bit about what was at stake with that? How you understand it?
I mean, I think that just something I didn't have the time or the chance to elaborate in the 5 to 7 minutes is the attack on the family is also, you know, aside from the restructuring of the term itself, children lose their families, which actually I feel like I didn't touch on enough, but just families were often separated. So children, you know, are sent to work camps depending on how good of a worker they are, and siblings were separated as well. So you're not only losing your parents, but you're losing your sibling bonds. And just the amount of cases I read where children either watched their parents murdered or their parents just disappeared in the middle of the night was really, really heartbreaking and, like, to be frankly, difficult to read about. But I think it was like Ben Kiernan wrote about it a bit in that the Children of Cambodia's Killing Fields introduction, if anyone's interested in like going back and reading that. But that's where he mentions the phrase or the term of family being restructuring as well. So it's more than just children losing their families, but that's what I found. Thank
you. Greg there, just. Sorry, Ethan, there's a Greg behind you, but please go ahead, Ethan.
I also had a question for you about the binary between like innocence and guilt. How does the guilt thing manifest in the culture today? Like, do people still believe that the child soldiers don't deserve respect or mercy or?
I think that in the context of the museum exhibits, there's more information and like personal narratives being shared around what it was like to be a child soldier. I mean, So for the memoirs too, when Broken Glass Floats, I don't believe that Shanrithi Him became a soldier, but Luang Ung did. So even just reading those, it was very interesting to read the experience of a child soldier and what that felt like, and the propaganda that went into the shaping of a child soldier. But I feel like today, it's more commonly recognized that children were forced to become perpetrators, but I didn't have the chance to look. The next thing I would be interested in looking into is the legal aspects of it, like were any of these people who were children and forced to murder people tried, or anything like that. But I just think it's important to recognize that, you know, in a society where a genocide happens, the perpetrator is not often completely separate from the victim. That was something I learned about in Argentina that really like changed my perception of what a genocide can even be. But in the case of Akira, I think that he dedicated his entire life to landmine removal. He actually like founded a foundation and everything because of that immense guilt. But yeah.
Greg, the other Greg.
My question is for Grace. Well, first, congratulations to all three of you. These were fascinating presentations. It's really interesting. And Grace, my question for you is about if you know anything about the choice of denomination here, that they seem to be mostly in dialogue with the Catholic Church rather than other Christian churches. And in some ways to me that seemed like a surprising choice, just because like the Catholic Church is the most hierarchical in its structure, with, you know, down from the Pope and archbishops and bishops, whereas like other Christian denominations are sometimes, the churches are a little more autonomous. And so it seems like there might be a little more flexibility, you know, outside of that realm of Catholicism. So I'm wondering why in this protest around the church, these communities chose to create sort of critiques of Catholic churches specifically. Does that question?
Yeah, definitely. So there are definitely Protestant gay churches all over. This is maybe the bigger and more enduring form of gay religion. So I think it's really a question of what do people believe about religion here. And Old Catholicism is a good vehicle from this because they have broken away from the Roman Catholic Church, and they don't give quite as much authority to the Pope as the Roman Catholic Church. But you can think about a place like Quebec, and Quebec is a very, very Catholic place, and so people believe in Catholicism. They don't believe in Protestantism. So I think it's affording gay people the same breadth of religious experience that straight people have. That's really the goal here.
Sorry, Liko in the back.
I got a question for Grace as well. I was wondering if someone was to research the gay independent Catholic movement, what sources would they be looking into to find some of these answers? What sources did you use?
A lot of newspapers, a lot of like gay rights publications. They often had a list of like, here are the churches you could go to in town. Things like that. If you want help finding those specific things, I can help out with that. There's not a lot of secondary scholarship on this at the moment. If we're talking about gay Catholicism specifically, there's more on the Protestant side of that. Yeah, so it really is in the world of primary sources at this point.
There's a question over there. Yeah.
My question is for Vivian. When you were researching your paper, did you come across any evidence of children or young people who were engaged in resistance against the Pol Pot regime, or was it mostly like children that were coerced into being child soldiers?
I actually think that so many of the children were just incredibly afraid of what would happen to them if they resisted. That would be so interesting to look into, though. I felt like if I did read about resistances, it was in smaller ways, or people writing about their internal feelings of resistance and what they were experiencing, like when they saw a family member ruthlessly murdered or something of the like. But like stealing food was one that I saw. I guess if you're looking at day-to-day resistance, or children that wanted to see their parents would sometimes like try to get out of work or run away. But on like a large scale, like armed resistance, I didn't see that. But I'd be interested in looking into those cases. I still think it's pretty new, but that's really cool. I'd love to look into that.
All right, yeah. One last question.
I have one last question for Vivian. I really thought it was thought-provoking about how you use different multimedia sources, oral history, museums, books, papers, and the internet in the last 20, 30 years, there's such a glut of new primary sources like just Twitter, YouTube, people just posting random like personal things online, and that will likely stay like on the internet for such a long time in a kind of in a way that isn't possible like before that. And I was wondering how you would see that kind of folding into academia in the future in this kind of age where there's so many different types of primary sources being documented and just being filmed in such a different way.
I think it's useful that these sources are becoming more accessible, actually. I mean, like I said, that like the oral history video I found on YouTube, so you don't need there's no block for that. Anyone can watch these oral history interviews. Same with some of the other ones, they're like publicly accessible online. I think that's really important in this emerging field. Like I said, I also think the graphic novel I found online too, I think that sources like that are teaching this generation's children about a topic as difficult as genocide are extremely important, kind of heading forward into an era where I feel like not all history teachers or classes are focusing on the Cambodian genocide or Southeast Asia at all. And so I think that it's generally going to be good that a lot of these things become more accessible, especially primary sources. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, I think that's a great question, and I wondered if Jade and Grace could also respond to that. I mean, I was very struck by that photo of the people in Regency.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it was really interesting because I really had different sources for the different eras. Like ancient times, I could really only look at the sarcophagus or like some context in the tomb. But for like the 1800s era, I was able to look at the British Newspaper Archive, which is like an online, pretty easy to access source. And like I found many of my newspaper sources through that online platform. And then for the modern day, it really was like looking at the museum website, looking at like Instagram posts that people who visited had made. So just like there's such a wealth of information that you wouldn't automatically think like, oh, I'll go to Instagram to find sources for my history paper. But it really can be useful. So yeah.
Yeah, I also used a lot of online newspaper databases, and that was really helpful. But I would say, particularly for my project, I used a few, or really one, oral history a lot as well. And of course, with the digital technology, it's a lot easier to share audio in that way. And so I think that was maybe a way in which those more digital sources was coming in. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you all for those reflections. All right, so that was our first fabulous panel. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the second panel. So please help yourselves to coffee in the back. And there are some more seats in the front scattered around. So if you want to get a seat, please come on up, and we'll start back up in about 10 minutes. Yeah.
There was less chairs in here this year. We had to grab some of our own.
Like the part about museums.
Yours was so funny, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, I did too.
I was like, the people need this silliness before I like.
Yeah. I think it's right to point out the silliness of it because it's ridiculous. Yeah. Have you ever been to like the UK?
it's hard to render it as a stable narrative.
Exactly.
And so when people kind of do historians or memoirists who try to stabilize the story, it's almost by definition hard to create. And people differ. So I think the fact that this is all
Yeah, because I think she titled her book like A Daughter of Cambodia or Methodist. That was after the first thing my mother heard. People were writing like, you're not even a real daughter of Cambodia. You have these like cultural importance and historical backgrounds. And I was like, well, it's not like it's really complicated. So I'd be interested in talking more about it. I'll send you an email. I was like, I can talk about this for hours and
there's a
hours.
lot of
I'm gonna check in with my friends.
Yeah, we don't really care about like the greater message. We just want to get by. That is true. What's your goal after you graduate? You said you were graduating. What do you aim on doing after you That is true. I enjoyed listening to your speeches.
Your presentation was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I wanted to ask you during the question, but my question was a little bit unclear, so I kind of left that alone. But you're talking about museums and holding off like certain kind of biases or narratives is incredibly fascinating. It's incredibly fascinating. So I guess my question would probably be is that if the items in question are providing the sort of narrative, do you think it would be a good idea of having like each individual item has its own like miniature history, how it got here, and whatnot, or any other ideas of like being more open towards that, towards that bias? Providing the origins of that item back to the country's origin, while still providing that information in other countries, which is actually very important.
Congratulations to you. It was reading your paper was such a pleasure, and I'd always heard about that museum from Elaine over the years, and I went for the first time this summer, and it's so bizarre. Like the idea of trying, and like you're exactly like you're saying right there, that sense of we honor Mr. Sohn above all else. Like, you would never do something unethical to collecting, but really the historical layers that you use to kind of trace them are really so fun to read. Impressive research. All right, I hate to kill conversation because there's so much good stuff to talk about, but I do want to bring us back for our second panel. I'm going to again introduce all of the speakers, and maybe we can do a slightly less convoluted logistical part, so you can come up after I introduce all three of you. I think it'll be clear who's who, and we'll do the same thing where we'll have the three presentations and then time for some Q&A at the end, and a little time to just gather after this is all concluded. So our first presenter in the second panel will be Ella Goldman, and the paper that she's presenting is entitled Women, Abortion, and the Third Reich, A Story of Selectivity, Complication, and Control. And this is a paper that was prepared in the context of topics in modern German and Europe with Edward Kaler, who is here with us. Thank you. And this paper received the History Department Linda Peterson Award in Women's History and a 2026 Dean's Award. So congratulations to Ella. The second presenter is going to be Ethan Strom, and the title of Ethan's paper is From Imperialist Lackey to Great Leader, Chinese Communist Party Perspectives on Martin Luther King Jr. in Life and Death. And this was a paper prepared in the context of History 194U, Cold War in East Asia, also with Noriko Aso, who's here in the audience. And this paper received the History Department Linda Peterson Award in Cold War History and also a 2026 Dean's Award. And the third presenter will be Danielle Chaplin, and the paper that Danielle is presenting is From Revival to Rebellion, Gendered Selfhood and the Rewriting of Irish Modernity in Kate O'Brien, Nuala O'Fallon, and she'll do this correctly, and she'll back to me, and Emma Donahue, sorry, so three writers. And this was a class that was prepared in the context of, with the support of Bruce Thompson in our department and Renee Fox in literature as part of THI Undergraduate Research Fellowship. And this paper also received the Linda Peterson Award in Literary History. All right, so those are our three presenters. Thank you all for being here. And tell you what, why don't you two stay, the people who aren't speaking, I'll move my jacket so you can just sit up here and not have to move back and forth and make the logistics a little bit easier.
Hi everyone, my name is Ella Goldman, and today I will be talking about my research paper, Women, Abortion, and the Third Reich, A Story of Selectivity, Complication, and Control. So, when I first tell people about the topic of my research paper, the first question is always, how in the world did you land on this topic? Well, my very first research paper in college was actually about abortion in the Soviet Union during Stalin, and it was also in Professor Kaler's class. And it's such a timeless and relevant topic. I thought that in today's day and age, I really wanted to look into abortion in a different time and place, a different context. And this also kind of felt like the perfect full circle moment for my college career to kind of end it exactly how it started. So to approach this topic, I asked three of the following research questions to kind of guide my research. So one, what were the Nazis' abortion policies and who did they apply to? Secondly, how was abortion part of the Nazis' broader goal of creating and controlling a greater German empire? And lastly, how do Hitler's views on women and race manifest themselves through abortion legislation? And throughout my research, I found that there was a distinct difference between pre-war Nazi Germany and World War II Nazi Germany. So I decided to narrow my paper's topic to 1933 to 1939 only, to narrow my topic even further. So from my research, I quickly discovered that abortion was part of a broader plan, heavily intertwined with Hitler's ideas that were manifested in Mein Kampf. So a heavy obsession with traditional gender roles and racial hygiene. So I determined that the Third Reich's approach to abortion before World War II was part of a selective and racialized natalist policy that used pro-natalism and anti-natalism in tandem as a tool to construct the Nazis' ideal nation. So for the pre-war years, pro-natalist policies did predominate, which reveals the regime's early obsession with population growth and demographics. So these subjective policies went hand in hand with the complicated role that women played during this time and emphasizes the level of control that the regime had over the population during its rule. So the ultimate goal of the Nazis was to increase the population in hopes of creating a great German empire, but this wasn't universal as part of the increase of, as the push to increase the birth rate became selective and only for those whom Hitler saw as racially superior. So this meant that a different set of policies applied to groups of people whom Hitler saw as inferior, which included but is not limited to Jews, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and prostitutes. So this led to concurrent and conflicting policies, as you can see here. On the one side, we have ideal German women, more widely known at the time as Aryans. They were faced with strict abortion laws that would send a woman to jail for up to 2 years for receiving the procedure, as well as welfare incentives to bear more children, which included a motherhood medal that was awarded to women who birthed a certain amount of children, which was on my introduction slide. On the other hand, we have groups deemed as inferior, and they were victims of forced sterilizations and forced abortions. In 1935, a law officially legalized abortions on racial grounds, and just 2 years later, the eugenics court determined that abortions were legally allowed on demand for Jews. So these policies reveal the Nazis' desire to selectively increase the birth rate, and they used abortions as a means to control and enforce who was and was not having children. So in my paper, I also looked into government-issued propaganda, which was heavily influential to legitimizing the regime and changing public opinion. So natalism was not exempt from the use of propaganda. As you can see here, we have two examples of pro-natalist propaganda. So on the left, we have a poster depicting abortion and those who perform abortions as evil. And on the right, we have a poster where it's glorifying motherhood, and it depicts an ideal Aryan family, dividing men and women into traditional roles. Propaganda was also used for the eugenics purposes as well, where Hitler would portray ideas of inferior individuals as burdens on the country, but that is not pictured here. So when I was doing my research, I scoured oral testimonies from dozens of women who recounted their experiences with forced abortions and forced sterilizations. However, most of these were from the Holocaust, which was outside of the scope of interest that I was looking into. So because of this, I did find a written testimony from a woman named Agnes, which is listed here, and she detailed her opposition to forced sterilization. Agnes was 42 years old, and she was diagnosed with congenital imbecility, and after birthing and raising 4 children as a single mother, she was forcefully sterilized in 1935, despite appealing the decision twice. So in finding evidence and testimonies, Agnes's story particularly stood out to me because it reveals the ruthlessness of the Nazis' policies towards women during this time and their subjectiveness to picking who could and could not have children. So overall, the goal of my research was to analyze Nazi abortion and natalist policies to determine what role it played in Hitler's overarching goal of creating the perfect nation. So it's clear through my research that the Nazis prevented abortion for some while forcing it for others and encouraged childbirth selectively. Abortion was an important tool used by the Nazis to control women and birth demographics, which aligns with Hitler's views on traditional gender roles as well as racial hygiene. So for my future research, I would like to shift my focus to the latter half of the Nazi rule, looking to abortion and natalist policies during World War II. Thank you.
I don't know what's.
Yeah, it's in that tab. If you want to click on that one, and then you'll be number 5.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Ethan Strom, and this is my project on how Martin Luther King was covered in the official Chinese Communist Party press during the Cold War, which I define as being from 1947 and 1991. The dates are a little bit flexible there. I came to this topic because I'm interested in Chinese history, and I especially am interested in looking at America from a Chinese perspective. I think a lot of the time the perspective goes the other way, where it's America looking at everyone else, and we don't really get to see ourselves from someone else's perspective. And Martin Luther King was one of the best known, is one of the best known civil rights activists. So I was just curious to see how he was covered. And I was quite surprised by how he was covered. It was at times very shocking. There's quite a lot of historical context that goes behind this that I am afraid I don't have time to explain, but I provided a timeline for it so that you can kind of follow along a little bit if you're not familiar with Chinese history. So Martin Luther King was first mentioned by name in Renmi Erbao, or People's Daily, in 1956. But as soon as the paper was founded in 1947, they were covering the Black liberation struggle in the United States quite heavily. They talked in totally unvarnished, frankly at times gory, terms about what happened to Black Americans, lynchings, racial discrimination. The Chinese public would have been very familiar with the Black struggle in America before Martin Luther King was ever mentioned. When he was first mentioned in 1956, it was in generally positive terms. They did mention that he was kind of a bourgeois element, being a pastor, but he was still fighting the good fight. And especially since China was trying to position itself as the leader of the semi-colonized and colonized world, the Black world in many ways. This was a good talking point for them. However, starting kind of in 1963, but definitely in 1964, the tone on Martin Luther King shifted very abruptly to calling him a puppet of the United States government who was actually trying to bring down the Black struggle, and Uncle Tom, which was also quite shocking given that I don't think a Chinese audience would even know what that meant. They were very, very denigrating towards his movement, starting in 1963, which I don't think was an accident, because 1963 was when John F. Kennedy started campaigning for the Civil Rights Act. So it seemed like Martin Luther King's nonviolent strategy was perhaps working. And at that time, the Chinese Communist Party was really leaning towards violent revolution being the only way to go, nonviolence being pathetic and not something that anyone with self-respect should be engaging in. This tone continued on until around 1971, 1972. And again, when it did shift, it was in accordance with Chinese politics of the time. Anyone who's old enough probably remembers when Nixon went to visit China. And that was a point at which China was at odds with the USSR, and they were willing to get back in bed with the Americans for their own national security interests. So a lot of criticism of the United States was just dropped. So there's about a 5-year silence on Martin Luther King and kind of just Black activism in general, starting around that point, which was especially sad, I would say, when you're looking at other Black activists who were covered at the same time as Martin Luther King. The Black Panthers, Malcolm X, were covered very positively before this shift, because they were not interested in nonviolence, and the Black Panthers especially were more interested in violent revolution. And the Panthers, in fact, right before Nixon came to visit the US, they were invited to China, even though the borders were closed to Westerners. They were invited to visit and tour the PRC, which was a big deal for them, because they really believed in a lot of the rhetoric of Maoism, that was being put forth by the PRC at this time. And after Nixon visited, Black Panthers are dropped. We don't hear about them again, I think, until 1979. In general, after the shift towards the U.S. politically, you see quite a lot of similarity towards with the way we kind of portray Martin Luther King now as this venerable figure above reproach. However, I would say that probably the biggest surprise in how Martin Luther King was covered was actually at the time of his assassination in 1968. In total, in the period that I covered, there were 150 articles on Martin Luther King, and 50 of them were produced within 2 months of his assassination alone, because the paper was just frothing with excitement about the riots that were happening all over the US, because they were predicting that this was going to be the beginning of America's communist revolution. And when it became clear that that was not going to happen, they went back down to not being obsessed with Martin Luther King anymore. And that 1968 was also the turning point where Martin Luther King was no longer directly criticized. They were still very anti-nonviolence, but they weren't calling him an Uncle Tom anymore. Trigger warning for the next slide for racism and racial violence. These are political cartoons that I got from the articles, and they're quite striking to an American audience, because we think of the KKK as being something that is part of our culture that maybe doesn't really get exported. But these cartoons show that the Chinese audience would have been very familiar with the way that the KKK looked and how they operated. These cartoons, at times they're quite funny. Like this one, I find pretty funny. It really shows that the cartoonists were really down to lampoon the racist Americans. And then you kind of get into these ones where it's not entirely clear whether they realize they're leaning into racial tropes, and it's also not clear whether they understand the gravity of what they're depicting. It's a bit too lighthearted, I think. This is depicting a lynching, this middle one here, and at least I personally think it's a little bit too cute for what it's trying to show. I would like to leave you with 2 questions. The first one is thinking about the difference between cynicism and sincerity here. On an individual level, I felt genuinely that a lot of the writers, especially of the earlier articles, they really believed in what they were saying. They really wanted to bring down imperialism, racism, etc. However, when you look at the larger scale of things, it's incredibly cynical coverage. The party's treatment of Martin Luther King as a whole is so incredibly cynical. He's just a political football. The second question that I'd like to leave you with is accessibility when it comes to research. So in order to get the articles for this project, I had to drive to UC Berkeley and sit at a physical computer in the UC Berkeley library. All of the articles are fully digitized, but you're not allowed to access them unless you're a UC Berkeley affiliate. And also, I say sit, I didn't sit for most of it. The first time I went, one of the students who was working there took pity on me and gave me a chair. But the rest of the second time that I went, one of the staff members told me that he was not allowed to give me a chair. So I stood at a standing desk for like around 8 hours. And I just want to leave you with the question of who is really able to do this kind of research. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Danielle Chaplin and my project is on queer female Irish authors' rewriting of selfhood and Irish modernity. So before I begin, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the Humanities Institute for their support via their fellowship and the Bertha Melkonian Award. And without the support of them, the history department, and the help of professors Renee Fox, Bruce Thompson, Greg O'Malley, and the lovely support of my wonderful fiance Jack, none of this would have been possible. So my project examines how marginalized Irish identities are displayed through a continuum of Irish literature post-Gaelic literary revival. My three authors, Kate O'Brien, Nuala O'Phelan, and Emma Donoghue, each exemplify the literature of their eras. This graphic shows the lives of these three wonderful women compared to a timeline of important legislative changes in Ireland. In 1923, universal suffrage was legalized in Ireland, which was well into Kate O'Brien's lifetime. And De Valera's constitution was ratified in 1937. He created what you think of when you think of like the Irish Constitution. And he had some very traditional views about women's roles in society. And so he kind of propagated that harsh Catholic women stay-at-home ideology at the highest level of the Irish government. In 1996, no-fault divorce was legalized in Ireland, which finally allowed women to initiate divorce without the approval of the Catholic Church. And this was during Nuala O'Phelan and Emma Donoghue's lifetime. And, 1996. And that same year, Nuala O'Phelan published her first memoir, which, as you can see, was published quite later in her life. Her main appeal was towards the neglected literary group of middle-aged women, specifically those who continue to have sexual desires in a world that wants women to be subservient. In 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized in Ireland. However, that legislative change came too late for Emma Donoghue, who left Ireland for Canada in 1990 to pursue a relationship with her wife and now her two beautiful children. The evolution of what topics were able to be published is clear when looking at how these three authors communicated their ideas. Kate O'Brien used indirect, coded representations of female desire in order to challenge Catholic censorship and rigid ideology. This outlook led to multiple of her books getting banned for scandalous sexuality, which most people wouldn't even bat an eye at today. This outlook led to by jumping from O'Brien to O'Phelan, you can see how much published work changed in 60 years. O'Phelan explicitly confronts queer identity and her dissatisfaction with Irish society through open and quite explicit depictions of female sexuality. Donoghue, who, modern day, prefers the reclamation of Irish queer and historical identity through the reconstruction of history by putting queer women at the forefront of history, showing that queer women have always been here and aren't going anywhere. She specifically will take real historical figures and put them into the stories of her fictionalized characters, blending history and fiction all together. All three of these women entwine their personal experience with the context with which they live in, as well as that which they were writing about. They all wrote historical fiction in some regard. Revealing Irish identity as contested, unstable, and gendered, rather than the standard drunken Irish stereotype that many people think of. And by using their stories of cultural critique, they were able to show how they saw the world and that it wasn't necessarily what Yeats or Joyce saw in the world. So some of my favorite details about doing this project were that I got to interview Emma Donoghue. She is the only surviving of these three authors. And I conducted an interview with her via email. I put a shot in the dark towards her publicist, and I hit a bullseye and was able to ask
questions about her intentions and with her characters and her personal experiences with being queer in both Ireland and Canada. And all of these authors had films about them. Well, two of them, Kate O'Brien and Emma Donoghue, had 2 film adaptations of their movies, one of which many of you have probably seen. It's the Oscar award-winning film The Room, starring Brie Larson. And Nuala had a documentary made about her life by her friends and family after her death. And the expansion of my literary grasp was huge during this. My new favorite book actually came from this project, Without My Cloak by Kate O'Brien. It is like Steinbeck's East of Eden, but better. If anyone likes that type of story, like the multi-generational epic, absolutely buy a copy of it. It is only being printed on demand. You can't find it in bookstores, and a lot of Kate O'Brien's work is slowly disappearing. That which is still being printed is on the pricier side. So here's the books that I read for this project. Quite a few of them were assigned for Bruce Thompson's Modern Irish History Seminar. And as you can see, it's a good blend of fiction and nonfiction. And then you can see Without My Cloak, my beloved, in the corner up there. So thank you all. If you're interested in reading the full paper, there's a QR code there. It's quite lengthy, but I figured I would give the option.
Can I invite all 3 of our panelists to come back up and take a few questions? Thank you all so much for all those presentations. That's great. All right. Questions for our presenters? Yeah, great.
I have a question for Ethan. I'm curious, I didn't notice come up in your talk the Vietnam War, and in domestically in popular opinions of King, that was, I know, an important turning point because his outspoken critiques of the war were, controversial for some white audiences that had been receptive to his message about civil rights prior to that. And yet it didn't seem to factor in. I think it probably supports your argument that that wasn't an inflection point for China, that they were thinking more about, their own internal politics and relations with the U.S. rather than moral stances or things. But I'm just curious whether the Vietnam War factored in there at all, and his critique of it more specifically.
It absolutely did, yeah. I had to leave so much out. They're posting the papers online, right?
No.
We don't haven't done that in the past, yeah.
Okay, yeah, there's quite a lot in the paper about the Vietnam War. It definitely factored into the Chinese side criticizing the U.S. They were not big fans of the Vietnam War, and they, especially after Dr. King was killed, they started talking a lot about the Vietnam War being kind of the cause of the downfall of the American empire. Like it was all going to collapse under its own weight. Yeah, there's a lot in there, but.
I have 2 questions for Ethan. The first is, how did you access the articles as a non-Berkeley student if they were only for Berkeley students? And the second one is your view that the Chinese's view of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was mainly driven by cynicism and they were willing to adapt when it was beneficial to them?
I think starting with the second question, I think it's a very complicated answer because on an individual level, I think a lot of the writers did really genuinely believe in what he was doing. And conversely, I think a lot of them really genuinely believed that he was a capitalist puppet when later on, because they were really gung-ho about violent revolution. Regarding the accessing of the articles, in order to access them, because I'm not a Berkeley affiliate, I had to drive physically to the library and use like the one computer that was actually working that has public access to the primary source materials, which was one of the standing ones without a chair.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to say that was a wonderful presentation for depicting all three of the authors that you were talking about, and both their similarities and individual points of view within Ireland. My question would be, off the top of your head, outside of the main three, what do you think a potential fourth or fifth author that you would say that you would recommend for researching more into Ireland?
Well, specifically Irish women, I would say definitely Edna O'Brien. She's not queer, but she was from the time of Kate O'Brien, and is an Irish literary revival writer. And then if you're looking more contemporary, there's Sally Rooney, who's a big superstar that most people have heard of. She wrote like Normal People, that was just made into like an HBO series or something. So if you're looking for more classics, I would probably say Edna O'Brien, and then of course there's like Joyce and Yeats, but that'll give you a very specific point of view. Yeah.
Can I slip in and just ask Ella a question? So I was thinking about that question of kind of access to source material and language, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you were able to access your sources and any of the kind of barriers you might have encountered in trying to do so.
Yeah, so most of my sources were thankfully translated into English because I do not speak German, but I did have Google Translate help me with the image search. If you take a photo of it, it will automatically translate it, and then I had a friend who speaks German would just verify that that was correct and I wasn't misquoting anything. But it was difficult for a few sources, like for my testimonies.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that. I saw a couple of hands back here. Yeah. Sorry, you have the jacket.
I had a question about the abortion and the third right presentation. I really like how you have the pro-natalist and the anti-natalist points side by side. I'd like your opinion about the relation to a current event, which is there's a lot of, because of the modernity of life, we have a lot of underpopulation in certain countries where there's the older people, there's not enough young people to take care of them, and a lot of countries are trying these like pro-natalist like policies to like get like people to have more children, and it's not really working that well. And I was wondering what your thoughts were of like your lessons from your research in relation to these problems in the current day. And I also have a second question about the chair, the 8 hours. What was the reasoning they couldn't give you a chair? I don't know.
Yeah, so, sorry, I got distracted. What was it? Your question was about, so honestly, the birth rate didn't increase much. Very, very little, and actually illegal abortions skyrocketed. So it was actually, since access was taken away, women were taking it upon themselves to do it illegally and under the table. So it really didn't increase the birth rate much, if anything at all, and mostly was just propaganda pushing the idea of motherhood.
The chair. So the place where I had to go to get the records had two like standing height computers and one that was actually wheelchair height. The wheelchair height one would not connect to the internet, so I couldn't really use it. It did have a chair. The standing ones, they didn't have chairs, and when I asked, they said, oh, we can only give you a specially reinforced chair because of like legability issues. And I guess they just decided to not have chairs at all instead of bothering to deal with that. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, sorry, one more question. Yeah.
I have a question for Danielle. First of all, I'm impressed by how many books you read. That is awesome. That is my dream to be able to read that many books. What was it like doing a project with both history and literature, because I'm politics and history, and I feel like that would be my dream to like somewhat intertwine the two, but what was that process like for you?
Well, it definitely started as more historical. The project was started in Bruce Thompson's Irish history class. And it was more tracking how Irish history has progressed by using these three authors as lenses. As, you know, Kate O'Brien was banned because she said the embrace of love. And then if you read any of Emma Donohue's stuff, or if you're aware of the plot of Room, it's about a woman who's kept in captivity and has a child with her captor. Very different things. That's an Oscar award-winning film, and Kate O'Brien's was banned. It was interesting. It was definitely helpful to have professor help in both the history and the literature department. Because everything is a part of history. The way that we react to it and the way that what we write about it now, what we write about the past now through our lens now is a reflection of this period of time. So I think it was interesting to do and definitely a challenge at some parts.
We have time for one more question. So, Grace?
This is for Ethan. I was wondering how, in your understanding, the Chinese Communist perspective understood what Martin Luther King Jr. was going for, and were there places where you were surprised that it was accurate, or places where you were surprised that it was very inaccurate?
There were quite a few inaccuracies. The first one that comes to mind is when they were covering the Montgomery bus boycotts, and during that period they were still being positive about him. They way overestimated the number of people that were actually boycotting the buses. They said it was 60,000, and that was only after 3 months of the boycott. Whereas the total number for the entire year and a half long boycott was 40,000. It really seemed like they were trying to inflate for their Chinese readership how on board the American people were with what he was doing. And I think on an individual level, the writers did understand what he was going for. They just disagreed at some points on his actual methods.
All right, well, I'd like to invite y'all to give our presenters a huge round of applause. And so at this point, I want to just say thank you all so much for being here. And if you have additional questions for our presenters, either from the second panel or the first panel, please come and chat for a little bit. I think there's still some coffee, still some water. So I hope you'll take a minute to visit. And I just really appreciate your being here and congratulate you all on your extraordinary work. So thank you.